Waluigi is the most neglected, underappreciated Chad in gaming. When will Nintendo recognize our boy in purple? While we're still not quite over Waluigi being absent from the Smash Bros. Guest list, we can of course celebrate the past and relish in the few good times. And even though Waluigi has yet to hold the spotlight by himself, he has certainly shined during the games in which he was included, and the Mario Kart series is no different. Waluigi's first track he ever had was basically a hand-me-down from Wario called Waluigi Stadium in Double Dash. It was very similar visually to Wario Stadium, being just a bunch of dirt and mud. Basically a visual representation of how Nintendo feels about Waluigi. Mario, however, a beautiful countryside track. Daisy, a cruise ship. Okay, that's a leap. Waluigi? Dirt. However, it was only 2 years after this muddy insult that we finally witnessed true greatness, and that is Waluigi Pinball. So in this video, we're going to see how Waluigi Pinball evolved over time, from its humble alpha beginnings to the work of art it is today. This is the evolution of the construction of Waluigi Pinball, so I hope you enjoy. So the year is 2005, and Mario Kart DS has rolled out. Now within this game was the beautiful debut of Waluigi Pinball, but hidden deep within the files are also other versions of this same map. And we can use these other versions to see how Waluigi Pinball evolved over time, how it achieved the pinnacle of greatness. So let's start with the classic, the final version that is within the game. Now in the normal course, you start at the bottom alongside where the actual pinballs are launched out. To your right is a giant stack of pinballs, and we have this giant glowing tunnel in front of us, and when we go through this, we feel like we are a pinball being shot to the top of the machine. And as we come out of this launch, we land on this upper part of the track that sort of slopes around. But as we're driving through this area, pinballs come down on top of us, and we have to avoid them. Soon after this, we go over a jump, and the pinball retreats down below, and we snake our way around till we eventually get to the bottom of the pinball machine. And in this section, there is pinballs bouncing between bumpers, going all over the place, and we are being looked down upon by this giant Waluigi. They built this giant statue of Waluigi in his honor, and hopefully, he will let us pass. And once we do, the course is finished, and we repeat. Now before we turn back the clock and go back in time, I want to cover a few different things in this level that you may not know. So the launching tunnel we go through is not solid ground. It's very similar to different levels where you get shot across the map. So trying to go back into this tunnel and drive through it will make us fall through the ground. No part of this tunnel is a drivable surface, so we are going to fall into the great beyond, and Lakitu is going to pick us up. Now in this map, on the wall, there's also a slot machine. And you may have noticed, and I actually think Shees has covered this a long time ago in one of his videos, but there's an outer slot wheel, and behind it is a flat texture of the slots lined up. And the reason why they did this with the two layers is because there is a certain range in Mario Kart DS in which objects far away from you will unload. They'll basically fade away and disappear, and they wanted you to be able to see this slot machine no matter where you are on the map. The problem is, if you're up on top of the edge of the map after you come out of that tunnel, you're too far away, so the spinning slot object actually unloads. So they put this flat texture back here so they at least had something visual to fill in the gap. And when you're far away, you can't really tell the difference, except for the fact that it does not spin. The last thing I want to do was try to make it into the pinball area where the pinballs are stored. But after several failed attempts, I realized that there is no collision in this area, so you'll just fall through the floor. And that sort of wraps up the basic Waluigi Pinball. But now let's go back in time, because as we go back in time, things get a lot more interesting, at least in my opinion. Now, the next stop on our adventure is the beta version of this map. The beta version is actually very similar to the final version. However, the track itself is different. Starting off, if you look to your right, you'll see that there are no pinballs in that wall like there are in the final version of the map. The tunnel in front of us works very similar to the final version, and we come out on top. Now, something I find interesting is the original layout of this top part of the course. So the shape of the green section of the track is relatively the same, but the beta version has bumpers scattered all throughout this section. And as we make it through this is where the track begins to change. So in the actual live version, you go up and you curve to the right and you drop down below. In this version, after where the jump's at, you sort of just go up and to the left and you sort of mosey your way down to the bottom. It's definitely not as exciting. It's not as pinball-like, I suppose. The curve in the final version of the track definitely makes me feel like I'm in a pinball machine. But what's kind of interesting is that we can infer, possibly, that the reason for this change was so that Waluigi's face would not be obscured. So at some point in development, they must have decided to put Waluigi in the background. And if you're standing at the top of the track, Waluigi's face would actually be obscured by that left turn I was just talking about. So instead, they had you take that quick right turn and drop down lower faster so that Waluigi's brilliance would not be interrupted. I mean, look at this fella. How dare anyone try to block that face? And before we talk about the bottom of this track in the beta version, let's actually talk about the upper part, because we did drive by something that is pretty interesting. So this map actually does have stadium lights all around it. And beyond that, there's also people in the stands underneath those stadium lights. So there's this garbled texture that is used to represent fans in stands, and this texture we see here is the same texture that they use in all the stands across different maps. So it's like this map used to be a hodgepodge of like Waluigi Stadium, a stadium environment, and a pinball machine. Whereas this weird combination actually had fans looking at this giant pinball machine down below as people race through it. So they really tried to preserve that stadium aesthetic of Waluigi's first quote-unquote track. But in the final version, of course, these things were removed. So as we get down below, the beta has a giant slot machine also in the ground, and you can use this as a ramp. So not only is there a slot machine up above, there's also one down below. So in total, there are actually 2 slot machines in this version of the map. But unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, there is no giant Waluigi, which is a sin against humanity, but I digress. What is interesting is that alongside this track is these giant buildings. So there's like a cluster of buildings at the bottom of the track where you start. And it's almost like a giant hotel or something that is tethered to this racetrack. It gives me hardcore Las Vegas vibes, where you have these giant hotels that stretch above the city and overlook all these areas where gambling takes place. Now the last change at the bottom of this map is, of course, the bumper layout. In the beta version, there's a cluster of 7 bumpers at that bottom condensed, and in the final version, it was reduced to 5 near the end. Perhaps they began to move things around when they realized they want to have pinballs actually bouncing around between the different bumpers. And after this, we hang a left and we're at the beginning of the track. But we are not done with our adventure yet. We can go back earlier in the construction of Waluigi Pinball to the simplest form of the map available. And this map is quite different, if I must say so. So I'm going to call this the alpha version because it's very, I guess, unfinished in some ways. Like the track is there, it's definitely solid, but the map itself is still in a very, very early state. Now this map in the files is actually referred to as a Luigi course. So it unfortunately looks like this wasn't even a Waluigi track. They probably felt guilty about the dirt, man. But apparently, the previous beta I just showed could have also been a Donkey Kong course, as it's named Donkey Course. I can't say for sure if these maps were intended to be suited to these characters, but the naming conventions does make you wonder. So the biggest change right at the start is that we now drive up the tunnel instead of being launched up like a pinball. This actually makes the process a bit longer, but it's kind of neat to see that at one point they intended you to actually drive up this big ramp. But as we get up top, the first series of turns is very similar, and there are bumpers sticking out of the walls. But as we make our way around, there's actually a flipper from down below placed up here. And honestly, this is a bit strange. Now the bumpers I mentioned earlier are actually placed in a way where they can actually cause you to fall out of the map. They stick out just enough so you can actually get behind them, and if you hit them just at the right angle, they'll push you into the wall, and the wall will push you back into the bumper, which will activate the bumper hitting you again, and this will just make you glitch through the floor and fall to your death. And the same thing kind of goes for that flipper. That flipper has some crazy momentum, and in this area, it can spell disaster. There are times where you can get hit by the flipper and get launched straight into the air as you fall down slowly, and there's other times where you can get hit by the flipper and it will launch you like a rocket way out of bounds. The physics of these things are definitely not suited for the very low walls that encompass this course. But as we come back to the track and drive through it normally, we eventually come to the bottom. And this area is drastically different. Now, do you remember that slot machine that was in the ground? Well, in this version of the map, it's a bit thinner, and this wheel that turns actually has a hidden pathway right behind it. So if you were driving fast, you would actually hop over this hole, but if you were driving slow, you would fall down below. And this hole takes you beneath the track and off to the right. So through this, you drive into an area that does not exist in any of the newer versions of this track. You eventually drive around, and you come out on top of a ledge, and you hop down below and drive straight to where the track repeats itself. Now, this lets you bypass the bumpers and the flippers down below, but the path is very long. Honestly, it's not really a shortcut. It takes way longer to go this way than it would take to just drive straight and take a left. So I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this was. Was it to punish people? Or maybe they had a lot of item blocks in here? I'm not sure, but I'm assuming they took it out because it took way too long to go through it compared to the normal route. Now, the last thing I did on this map was actually ride out of bounds. So the edges of this map can be driven on. Now, I do not know if this was the modder who packaged this all back together, or whether collision was actually assigned out here. So for the maps that I've been using in this video, I was actually using a mod that packaged the beta tracks that made them accessible again so people could play them. This was done by a team of talented individuals who you can see their names on screen now, but as I was driving around, I found it really interesting to be able to drive between the different tracks and all around basically on the perimeter of this entire area. For reference, all the other versions of this map, the newer ones, actually make you fall through the ground if you try to go anywhere that isn't a defined piece of the course. But with this, we've come to the end of the legacy of the construction of Waluigi's Pinball. I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown of one of Mario Kart's most sacred maps. And of course, I'll see all of you in the next video. Cheers!